In this tutorial, you will learn to create a full-stack web application from scratch using Microsoft SQL Server for the database, .NET Core Web API for the backend, and Blazor for the frontend. We will first start with creating the necessary tables in Microsoft SQL Server. Then we create the Web API project with the required REST API endpoints. Finally, we will use Blazor for creating the frontend. You will learn how to add routing for our app. Create Bootstrap Table with custom sorting and filtering capabilities. Add model pop-up window with drop-downs and date pickers. We will also learn how to upload an image and store it in the backend server. Let's install Visual Studio. You can choose to install the community version, which is free to download and use for educational purposes. Run the installer file. I have already installed Visual Studio, but if you are installing for the first time, you will be presented with this screen. You can choose ASP.NET and Web Development, .NET Desktop Development, and .NET Cross-Platform Development, and click on Install button, which appears in the bottom right. Let's install Postman. We will be using Postman to test our REST APIs. Let's install SQL Server Management Studio, which is used to work with SQL Server database. Run the installer file. You can keep the default options and click on Install. It is asking me to restart the PC, so let me do it. I'm running the installer again after restarting. The setup is now complete. Let me start SQL Server Management Studio. I have already procured a Microsoft SQL Server and a database using Microsoft Azure. I will use the same. You can also create a local server and database by installing the developer edition of SQL Server. We are now ready to create the necessary database objects. Let's create the database tables required for our app. We can see that currently we don't have any tables. We need two tables for our app, one to store department details and another one to store employee details. Let's start with department table. This table will have two fields, one to store an auto-generated table ID and another one to store the department name. Let's insert some records using insert query. Now let's check the data in our table using select query. Let us similarly create table to store employee details. We will be storing employee ID, employee name, department to which the employee belongs to, the date of joining, and also the uploaded profile picture file name. Let's insert a record. And check data using select query. We have now successfully created the database objects needed for our app. Let's create the .NET Core Web API project. Let's open up Visual Studio first. Click on Create a new project. Choose ASP.NET Web API Core. Choose appropriate folder. We might not need HTTPS for now. Now let's take a look at some of the important files. All the dependencies and packages needed for our app can be found in the dependencies folder. Launch settings.json file contains the details of how the project should be started. Controllers folder contains controllers in which we write our API methods. We generally keep the configuration details such as database details in appsettings.json file. The program.cs contains the main program, which is the entry point of our app. Also, it creates web host, which basically helps the app to listen to HTTP requests. The startup class configures all the services needed for our app. Services are basically reusable components that can be used across our app using dependency injection. It also contains the configure method, which creates our app's request processing pipeline. We need to make a couple of changes in the startup class. One is to enable the CORS. By default, all Web API projects come with a security which blocks requests coming from different domains. We're basically writing instructions to disable that security and allow the requests to be served. We are also making one more change to the serializer class to keep the JSON serializer as our default. We might need to install a NuGet package to do this. Let's import the namespace. Now let's simply run the project and check if everything works fine. We see that the project works as expected, and we see the JSON result from one of the sample controller method. Now let's create the models needed for our app. Let's create a folder to add our models. Let's add the department model. Department model has two fields, department ID and department name. Next, let's add the employee model. It has 5 fields, employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining, and photo file name. Let's start creating the API methods. Let me first add the database connection string in the app settings JSON file. Now let's add an empty controller to write our API methods for department details screen. Let's name it as department controller. To work with database, we need to install a database client. Let's install it with a NuGet package. Let's also import the namespaces. To read connection strings from app settings file, we need to make use of dependency injection. Let's first create a variable of type iConfiguration. It will be instantiated inside the constructor during runtime. Now let's write an API method to get all data from department table. The attribute HTTP GET indicates that this method will only allow GET requests. The return value from this method will be JSON array. I'm writing raw queries here. You can choose to write stored procedures or maybe use entity framework for this. I'm writing select query on the department table and select the two columns department ID and department name. I will be getting the data from the database into a data table object. Let's get the connection string from the app settings JSON file using the configuration instance. We will be using data reader to fill the data table with data which comes from our database query. We will be executing the database commands in the database within the using clause. This will make sure to close the connection even if there are any exception. We will first open the database connection, and using the given query we create a command. We execute the command using the execute reader method since we are expecting a return value from the select query. And then we will fill the data into data table using data reader. Once this is done, we close the data reader and the connection. Finally, we will return the data table data in JSON format. Let's test this API method. This seems to work. Let's now add the post method to insert new record into department table. The attribute will now be HTTP post, and instead of select query we will now use insert query. We will be sending the department object to our post method in the form body. We will be passing the values to our command using command parameters. This will avoid SQL injections. Let's also create the put method to update records. For update query, we need to pass the new department name and also the ID of which we are trying to update. And finally, let's implement the delete method. The attribute will now be HTTP delete. And let's write our delete query and pass the ID of which we need to delete. Now let's test our API methods. We will be using Postman to test since we can test only get method in the browser. The get methods seems to be working. Let's add another department using post method. Looks like we are not sending the success message after adding. Let's try again. We see that the record is added successfully. Let's verify this using get method. Now let's use the put method to update a record. The put method also works as expected. Now let's check the delete method. We need to make some changes to the delete method attribute to accept ID in the URL. We see that delete method also works as expected. Let's implement the API methods for employee details screen. Let's add an empty API controller. Let's copy the contents from department controller and make changes accordingly. Now let's test our APIs. The get method works fine. Let's test the post method to insert a record. Post method also works as expected. Now let's test the put method and update a record. And finally, let's test the delete method. The delete method also works as expected. Let's now write an API to upload the photos. Let's create a folder to store photos. To be able to use this folder to store and retrieve photos, we need to add some instructions in startup class. Now let's write the API method. I'm giving a custom route name for this method, and this is a post method. If there is any exception while saving the file, I will simply return the default anonymous picture file name. We are going to extract the first file which is attached to form data. We need to again use the dependency injection to get the application path to photos folder. Once the file is saved, we will simply return the file name. Let's now test the API by uploading an image file. We see that the upload was successful and we can see the image in the newly created path. Let's start creating the front-end project using Blazor. So let's first open up Visual Studio and click on create a new project. There are basically two templates that we can use to create the user interface using Blazor. One is the Blazor WebAssembly app, which mostly runs on the browser and kind of reduces the load on the server. And the second template we have is the Blazor server app, which mostly runs server side, and it's kind of easy to handle the user interactions over a signal or connection. And developing a user interface is pretty much similar in both these templates. So let's just choose Blazor server app and click on next and choose the appropriate folder to create our project. Let's click on next. And we might not need to use HTTPS for now, so let's just uncheck this and click on create. So now let's take a look at some of the important files in this project. All the packages or dependencies that this project needs can be found inside the dependencies folder. And we have got some example model class and methods inside the data folder. The components can be found inside the pages folder, The components in Blazor will have an extension of .razor. Host.cshtml is the root page, and we can see the HTML with head and body section here. Counter.razor is a sample component that's created in a Blazor project. This is available in route path /counter. The shared component contains the components that can be embedded in other components. Imports.razor contains common razor directives to include in the components. The app.razor is the root component of the app that sets up the client-side routing using the router component. We can store our configuration details such as API URLs in the app settings.json file. Program.cs is the app's entry point that sets up ASP.NET Core host. The startup.cs contains the app's startup logic. It has two methods: configure services. The configure services method configures the app's dependency injection services, and the configure method configures the app's request handling pipeline. Let's simply run the project and see how it looks in the browser. We can see that we have a navigation menu and a default counter component. So the count just increments for each button click here. Now let's add the routing and navigation to our application. We will be using Bootstrap for styling the application. So let's import Bootstrap first. So let's open up host.cshtml. Now let's add Bootstrap. Just click on get started and just copy this CSS, and we can place the CSS in the head section. And the bundle section can be added near the closing body tag. Now let's open the main layout .razor, and we will just remove the default content and add our navigation menu using Bootstrap. So let's add a div with the class equal to container. And we need to have the keyword body. So during rendering, the body will be replaced by the content of the layout. Let's add a heading tag with h3, and let's add some class to it to kind of align it to center, Bootstrap flex, and we'll justify it to the center. And let's add text Blazor frontend. Let's create the components before adding the navigation menu. We need basically two pages for our app, one to store the one to manage the employee details, and another one to manage the department details. So let's create two components in the pages folder. Right click on it and click on add and razor page. So we'll choose the razor component and let's call it as department.razor. And we can use the for routing, we can use the page keyword, and we can map /department to department component. Let's add another component for employee details. And /employee will be routed to employee component. So now let's add the navigation menu. So let's add buttons for navigation. The button will have a margin of 1 and a light color. So first one will be the home component. So the home component can be found here. So similarly we will have department and employee. We have already defined the route paths, so department will be just department and /employee will be routed to employee page. So let's just check if this works. So we see that the routing works as expected. Now let's create a Bootstrap table and display the department's data in the Bootstrap table. So but before that, let's first add the API URLs in the app-settings.json file. Let's also add the photo URL, which contains the application path to the photos folder. Now let's add the Bootstrap table. Before adding the table, let's import some of the modules that we will be needing. So the first one that we will need is system.text.json, which we'll mostly be using for passing the JSON data or maybe serialization, and using system.text.json.serialization. And to consume the API methods, we need to import HTTP client. So let's import that. And also let's inject iConfiguration to be able to read the configuration, the API URLs from app settings. And finally, let's import JavaScript runtime. This is for executing the JavaScript functions using C# code. Now inside the code we can write our methods and also declare variables or classes. So let's first define the class that we will be using for department's data. So let's define it with name department class. It will have only two fields. One is department ID and another one is a department name. Let's define an array variable to store the department's data and use it inside the HTML. Let's call the name as departments and initialize it with an empty array as of now. So let's write a method to consume the get API and fetch all the details and populate the departments array. So this will be an async method. Let's call it as refresh list. Let's create an HTTP request. And this will be a get method. Next we need to specify the URL which we will get from the configuration file or the app settings.json file. The key that we gave was API_URL. So we need to call the department API method. Now let's create a client instance. Let's use the send async method and initiate the API method. So once the response is available, we will be deserializing it. We will get the response from as JSON format and we will deserialize it to department class. So we will be deserializing it to department class and we'll be assigning it to the departments array. So we have a lifecycle method in Blazor called as on initialized async. So once the page is initialized, we will call the refresh method here. So we'll refresh the departments array once the page has been initialized. Okay, now we will make use of this departments array and display the data in a Bootstrap table. The table will have a head section and a body section. The head section will have 3 columns. Sorry, it will have a first one is we have tr. Inside tr we will have headers. We'll have 3 columns, one for department ID, one for department name, and last one will be an options column, which will have options to edit or delete a department. So we'll be making use of the departments array, and we'll be using the for each method to loop through the departments array and display the data. So we'll be using td and display the department ID. Department name, and in the options column we will have 2 buttons. One button for editing the department, another one for deleting the department. Let's use Bootstrap icons for these buttons. Let's also add Bootstrap icon for delete. Okay, let's see how it looks. Let's use Chrome browser. We can change the browser settings somewhere here. Yep, we can choose Chrome. Looks like we have some exception. So looks like the exception is coming from the client factory import that we did. We need to basically import it, add the entry in configure services as well. So let's go to configure services and we'll do services dot add HTTP client. Okay, the data is proper, but I think we have some styling related issue, so let's check. Yep. So we see that the data is now displayed in the grid. So now let's add a model pop-up window which we will be using to add new department or maybe edit an existing department. So we will basically use the same model window for adding a new department and also editing an existing department. So we'll define the title of the model through a variable. So let's create a variable called model title, and also in the form fields we need to have the department ID and department name. So we'll dynamically set the title and the department ID, department name based on whether we clicked on the add new department or update the existing department. So let's write that method. So first one is the add click method. So model title will be add department, department ID equal to 0. So if we are adding a new department, we don't need to set the department ID, so we are setting it to 0, and department name will be empty. And during the edit department, we will be passing the department object which we are supposed to edit. So the title will be edit department, department ID will come from the object, also the department name. Now let's add the model window, which is basically the Bootstrap styled model pop-up window. Class equal to we'll set the ID as example model. So as I already discussed, we will be using the title. We will be using variable for the title. So it will be dynamically set based on whether we clicked on add department or did we click on button edit department button. In the model body we will have only one form field, which is department name. So let's create an input group to display a text box for adding a new department or maybe editing an existing one. So this will be a text box. And we have a keyword in Blazor called .bind. We have a keyword called bind. So it kind of provides two-way binding between the variable and the data that we enter inside the text box. So next we need to have button, one button for adding a new department and another one for editing department. So if the title is add department, we will display the create button. Else we display the update button. Let's also add the method to add a new department or maybe update an existing one. So let's copy the method where we are consuming the API, and let's rename it to create click. So this will be we will be using this method to add a new department using the post API method. So we change the method to post, and we need to send the new department object. So let me define department object. Department class, and the department name will be coming from the variable that we entered in the text box. So let's attach this object to request.content. We need to serialize it as JSON, so let's use string content JSON serializer dot serialize department object. We'll keep encoding as null, and media type will be application JSON. So we will be getting the response as a string, so let's deserialize it as a string instead of department class. And finally we will also display the message that we got using the JavaScript invoke method. So we'll be displaying the message in the alert box. Also let us refresh the array so that the grid gets updated. So let's make a copy of it and just change it to update for editing an existing department. So we need to pass the department ID also along with department name to update the department name based on the given department ID. So this will be a put request and rest all will remain the same. Let's use this method for our update and create buttons. So on click equal to create click and update click. Now we need to add a button to display, show the model window for adding the department. So let's add a button here. To open the model window. So this will be the same ID that we are using for the model window. So we need to execute the add click method on click of add department. So this will basically set the model title and the form fields. So let's name the button as add department. So similarly we need to have the same functionality for department update. So in the edit department we need to pass the department object which we are trying to edit. Let's also implement the delete method. So for delete we will be passing only department ID. We don't need an object. We need to call the delete method and pass the ID in the URL. We don't need content for delete, so I think the rest all will remain same. So let's just execute this and test the model window and the other features. Let's click on add department. Looks like we have some issue in the styling, so let's check what is that. So input group, let's try again. Okay, the form fields looks fine. We have the title also displayed correctly, and we have a create button. Let's add a new department. So we see that it was added successfully, and on click of OK we see that the refresh also works. Now let's try to edit this. We see that the update also works as expected. Finally, let's test the delete one. So before delete, I think we need to have a confirmation from the user. So let's add a confirmation pop-up or a confirmation box before deletion. So we're going to invoke a confirmation box, and we will ask are you sure? So if the value is false, we will simply return. So if they clicked on yes, we will execute the delete function. Okay, I think this will be a lowercase. Okay, we see the confirmation window. Let's click on OK, and we say that it was deleted successfully. Let's now complete the employee details screen. So let's just copy the contents of department details screen, and then we make changes to it. So let me copy everything from departments component. So this one will be add employee instead of add department. And in the columns we have employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining. Let's first declare the variables that we need. So let's define a class for employee details. So it will have employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining, and photo file name, which is basically the uploaded profile picture file name. And along with departments array, let's also define employee array. We're going to make use of the departments array in the drop down. While adding a new employee, we need to select a department from the drop down, so we'll be using it there. So let's just keep it, and we'll define another array for employees data. And in the form fields, we will have employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining. So let's make the form field of date of joining as date time, because we'll be binding this variable to a date picker in the form field. Photo file name, and finally we will also define a variable to store the photo path, which is basically the application's path to photos folder. So let's get it from the config file, which we already have put in app settings.json file. So photo path will be coming from the config, and the key name we gave was photo_URL. Also let's add a default picture file name as anonymous.png. In the refresh list, we need to refresh both the departments data as well as employee data. Okay, so we'll be updating both departments as well as the employees array, and this is going to be employee class. So this looks fine. So in the create click, we need to send the employee class. Let's convert the date to a specific format before sending. Okay, so I think the rest of the things will be same. Let's copy it in the update object as well, update method as well. So in the update method we should also send employee ID. Okay, the delete should also be fine. And in add click, instead of add department, the title will be add employee, and we see reset the form fields of employee, which is employee ID, employee name, department. Let's set the date of joining to current date time. And photo file name will be the default picture file name. Let's make changes to the edit click method. So this will be employee class, edit employee, employee ID, employee name, date of joining. So we need to convert this to a date time to bind it to the date time picker, date picker. Now let's move to the HTML part. We have employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining, and okay, this one is fine. Okay, I think the Bootstrap table should be fine. Now let's move to the model window. In the model window, we need to display both the employee details fields and also the employee profile picture. So let's use a Bootstrap Flex to have a kind of two column view. So in the left column we will be showing the employee fields. W50. and in the right side we will show the uploaded profile picture. We will compute the source from the variables. So the first thing is we have the photo path, and we append a slash and then append the photo file name. And the next one we have is employee department, and this will be a drop down instead of a text box. And we are going to bind the value to department variable. We are going to make use of the array that we have, and we have populated the department's details. So we are going to make use of this array to display the options for the drop down. So we'll display the department name, and then finally we have the date of joining. And date of joining will be a date field, so we change the text to just date. So let's see how this looks in the browser. So seems like the table is displaying the data correctly, and let's check the model window. So the drop down seems to be fine, and also the date picker also works as expected. Now let's add the method to upload the image file. So we will add an upload button here to upload new profile picture. To be able to work with image uploads, we need to install a NuGet package. So let's just first install it. The package name is called Blazor input file. We need to also add a reference, JavaScript reference in the host HTML. So let's just add it. Let's import the module. We'll import system.io as well because we need to convert the uploaded file to memory stream. Now let's write the method to upload the image to the post API method. we'll get the first file which was uploaded, so we will upload only the first file, only one file. I'm declaring a memory stream so that we convert our uploaded file into a memory stream. So let me declare a multi-part form data content. We are going to attach this to the post method, the upload file post method. Now let's copy the post method and make changes to it. Let's make change to the content that we are going to attach the file. And once the response is available, we are going to, the response will be the file name itself, so we are going to simply assign it back to the photo file name variable. Now let's invoke this method and add an upload button. So we will add it near the image file, the image tag. So input file, margin 2, and we're gonna write on change. We will call the upload file method. Now let's test this method and the other features in the employee details screen. So we see that the upload was successful. Let's give a name, department. So this should be department. We'll change it later. And here let's give date of joining as 14th and click on create. So we see that it was added successfully. Let's change the field name. So this should be department name. Let's test the edit method. We see that edit also works And let's finally test the delete method. We see that delete also works as expected. Let us now implement a custom sorting and filtering feature for our Bootstrap table. So we will be doing it only for the departments grid. So let's first define a couple of variables to capture the filter text input from the users. So let's define the department ID filter and department name filter. Let's also define a variable to store the backup data or departments array without any filter. And we need to populate both departments without filter and with filter in the refresh list. So let's first implement the filtering function. So we are going to filter the departments array without filter, which contains all the data, and then reassign it to the departments variable so that it gets automatically updated in the screen. So we're going to use LinkQ to filter from the text input. So first we're going to filter based on the department ID. And we are going to use the contains built-in function. And we're going to build a filter based on the department name as well. So before checking, let's convert into lowercase. Now let's add a text box to accept the input from the user for these filters. We are going to have a text box along with a button in the same alignment. So let's add the text box first. And we are going to bind the department ID filter. Now let's add a button to call the filter function. The text will be filter. Let's add the same thing for department name also. So let's just test if this works. So we see that the filtering function works as expected. Now let's implement the sorting function. We will have two buttons for each column, one to sort in ascending and another one to sort the descending. So let's first implement the sorting function. So it will accept two parameters. One is the property or the column name, and another one indicates whether we need to sort it in the ascending order or do we need to sort it in descending order. So let's write first for department ID. And if so, we're going to pass the string value like whether to sort it in ascending or descending order. So if we are passing the string as ASC, which means that we want to sort it by ascending order. So let's sort our array. We're going to use the order by clause, which is available in the link queue query, and we are going to pass the department ID. And in the else section we need to sort it with descending order. So we have the method called order by descending, and we can use this. So in the else part we'll be adding the logic for the second column, which is the department name. Now let's add the buttons to sort it by ascending or by descending order. We'll have two buttons for each column. So we need to pass the column name and the string ascending or descending. Another button for sorting in descending. Let's add Bootstrap icons. One icon for the ascending order and another one for descending order. Let's add the same thing for department name column and just change the property name. So let's just test if sorting works. So we see that the sorting also works as expected.